So, thank you everybody for coming. It's great to have you here. We are here to discuss populism and Euroscepticism, obviously. You know, these are two subjects that the political society has been contemplating on discussing for a long time. The times definitely demand for the subjects to be discussed. And we have two leading experts in the fields of Euroscepticism and populism. We are really blessed to have them as professors here at Sussex. It's Professor Aleks Szczerbiak. He's the head of the politics department. And we have Professor Paul Taggart as well. They have both contributed largely to the fields of Euroscepticism and populism by writing multiple papers and doing research in these fields. Many years before it became fashionable, I might add. And here we are now, 2024. We have a war in Europe raging. We have states that have either exited or are contemplating exiting the European Union. So what better time to discuss about these topics than now? The event will begin with a question and answer from a number of questions we have drafted. And midway, we're going to cut and bring the audience into the Q&A. So feel free to ask any questions. And at the end, we'll continue with the rest of the questions and conclude with another Q&A. So the first question is to Professor Szczerbiak. What does the existence of a demagogue like Trump mean for Europe? And what would be the implications of a second Trump term for Europe?
Okay, well, thanks very much for inviting me along. It's really nice to be talking to the Politics Society. I should say, before I get going, that although Petros gave this glowing intro, which I was very happy for him to kind of carry on talking about for a long time. I mean, there's a lot of these things that I'm not an expert in. Paul knows a lot more about them than me. So before I get into answering a question about Donald Trump, I mean, I'm not an expert on foreign policy. I'm not an expert on security policy. I'm certainly not an expert on Donald Trump. I'm not a Trumpologist. It's Paul who teaches American politics. So a lot of what I'm going to say here to this, and probably to a lot of the other questions, is sort of shooting from the hip a bit. It's kind of, you know, sort of a pub style rant. But anyway, hopefully that will get some ideas and discussion going. So I'm going to say three things about the possible impact of Donald Trump second presidency on Europe. The first one is that Donald Trump doesn't like and doesn't get on with the EU political establishment, okay, or the European mainstream, if you like. So we're talking about the cluster around the Franco-German axis, or Berlin, basically. That's the European EU political establishment is essentially Berlin. So unlike Joe Biden, who for a long time, basically till the outbreak of the Ukrainian war, was happy to mediate his European policy through Germany, essentially to kind of contract it out, although he obviously retreated from that when the Ukraine war started. Donald Trump gets on very badly with the EU political establishment and will look for lots of opportunities to try and build alternative vectors, alternative alliances. During his first term, he did built a lot of alliances with Poland, with Hungary. Now the government's changed in Poland since October, so he's not going to do that. But somebody like Giorgia Meloni, for example, in Italy, is somebody who'd be much more ideologically simpatico. So his first term was characterised by trying to build up alternative power blocks and alternative bilateral links to the EU political establishment, and we'll see a lot of that, I think, in his second term. I mean, Britain, potentially, this is actually quite a good opportunity for Britain, all things being equal, because Britain's obviously, Donald Trump really liked Brexit, and he liked the fact of Britain leaving the EU. The problem is we're going to have, almost certainly, put money on it, have a change of government in Britain as well at the end of the year. So precisely the point at which, you'll get a US president who might be more amenable to things like trade deals or whatever, building bilateral relations, you'll get a government that's much less amenable to working with Donald Trump. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is in terms of the war in the Ukraine. So I think there's a widespread expectation that the election of a Trump presidency will hasten a negotiated end to the war in Ukraine, and that is probably true. However, having said that, I think that that's kind of the way that the wind is blowing anyway, and I think there are lots of European actors that, quite frankly, would quite like that outcome as quickly as possible, including Germany. I think, although Trump and Germany, they don't see eye to eye on many things, I think Germany would actually really like the war to end as quickly as possible. The main obstacle for Germany is Putin. It's very, very difficult to negotiate with somebody like Putin, and politically it'd be really unacceptable. If there wasn't someone like Putin, if there was a more kind of acceptable Russian imperialist like Navalny, for example, I think that Germany would have been pushing much harder for a negotiated settlement. So I think, yes, that's going to accelerate that, but that kind of goes with the grain anyway, of where I think a lot of people in Europe, including people that Trump's not particularly sympathetic with, would want to go. And then finally, the question of military security guarantees, and speculation that Trump, will withdraw from NATO or start to undermine Article 5 of the NATO treaty. Well, I mean, again, you have to look at what Trump's like in his first term. And for me, I'm no expert in this, Trump didn't seem to be an isolationist in his first term. In his first term, I think he was very inward-looking in terms of American policy, but he was also prepared to kind of project American force, particularly in terms of deterrence, but I think more broadly, if he felt that the West's and America's interests were threatened. So I think it's very unlikely that he's actually likely to withdraw from Europe militarily. In fact, if we look at Donald Trump's first term, what we see is actually, because one of the things he definitely wants is Europe to spend more money on defence. It's completely unacceptable to him, and indeed to a lot of Americans, that 70% of Europeans' defence is being provided by the United States. And in his rather sort of clumsy way, he will articulate that, and that's definitely what he wants. But in a sense, that message is kind of getting through. Germany's already announced it's going to increase its defence spending, and during the Trump first term, defence spending was considerably increased in Europe, which actually turned out to be very, very handy when the war in Ukraine broke out. Okay?
So, Professor Taggart, what do you think would be the implications of a Le Pen victory in France, and how likely do you consider it to be?
So, like Alex, I'm going to start off with a caveat, because I'm not a French policy expert. But I'm a comparativist who looks at Europe and I like looking at France, because I mean this in the nicest possible sense, it's very weird politically, and has very different patterns than we expect elsewhere. And I think what's interesting about French politics, many interesting things about it, has been the fact that the radical right, the populist right, has been there since the 1970s, 80s. They've been very embedded in them, and I think it's what's the gradual growth of the national rally as it now is really significant. I think what we forget with French politics is that we look at this kind of contest between, like we might look between Trump and Biden, between these two figures. But what's interesting is that French politics was always built around the idea the institutions were designed to make it a centre-left versus a centre-right conflict. And what's most interesting about contemporary French presidential politics to me is the absence of a mainstream centre-right or centre-left party. We talk about what Macron is a little bit. So the Parti Socialiste and the Republicans are nowhere at the moment. And so it's become this contest between two sides, between quote, the mainstream, or as popular like to say, the establishment, right, and the outsiders. So if Marine Le Pen was to win the presidency in 2027, I think it would be the culmination of a long-term trend of French politics. I think it's possible. It's 50-50 at the moment. If I had to put money on it, it's a real possibility. The key factor that matters now is not so much what Le Pen does, but what Macron does. And Macron can't run again, and the question of succession is a real issue for him, something he doesn't seem to be addressing as to who might be the next potential presidential candidate for Macron's party. So the success of Le Pen, and let's not underestimate it, would be really significant for Europe. I don't think it would change Europe as much as you might be expecting from what Aleks said. You know, this Franco-German axis, you know, it really upset it to have a kind of Eurosceptic in power. Well, let's look at what Meloni's done in Italy. She's kind of pulled back from many of the things she said and changed positions. So Marine Le Pen in office will probably be more constrained than we would expect. It won't be as dramatic. She would affect things, not that she wouldn't affect things, but on the other hand, she could act like a Trump figure, kind of chaotic, disruptive, but I think that's less likely. So I think it's possible. I think if a success of Le Pen would be the culmination of a long-term trend, but we need to think about it. We need to think of the possibility of that, and to see that not as something that's kind of exceptional, but in a sense of proof that, it's a question later on, that what is right to become the mainstream in France.
Well, let's jump to the most severe evidence of Euroscepticism in Europe, Brexit. So after Brexit happened, even the hardest Brexiters have been starting to challenge the idea of Brexit, giving rise to a potential second Brexit referendum. Many people say that this is somewhere within the horizon. So, Professor Szczerbiak, how likely would the second Brexit referendum be, actually?
Okay, very unlikely. Okay, I could just leave it at that, but you presumably want a bit more of an answer than that. So, I mean, the question is, in whose interest would it be to call a second referendum, basically? Well, certainly not in the interests of the Brexiteers, because why? You know, they've won, why would they call a second referendum? So it's basically the pro-EU camp that would want a second referendum. But the problem is that obviously the main actor in the pro-EU camp that might be in a position to deliver on this, which is the Labour Party, Keir Starmer government that we're probably going to have by the end of the year, for political strategic reasons, can't go for a second referendum, basically. I mean, even if they wanted to, which I presume a lot of them do, they for political strategic reasons they can't do it. I mean, the story of the 2019 UK general election was the collapse of the so-called Red Wall. Okay, this was significant sections of Labour voters who voted Conservative for the first time in their lives, okay, in constituencies like the one I grew up in, Loughborough, in the East Midlands, who had never voted Conservative before and did so in order to get Brexit done. Okay, it was an issue that, and Keir Starmer and the Labour leadership know this. Interestingly, in 2017, I actually think Jeremy Corbyn, who got many other things wrong from a political strategic point of view, on this issue kind of had it right, really. I mean, the Labour Party neutralised the issue quite well by basically saying, well, yes, obviously we just accept the result and we need to move on from it, and we need to talk about much more important things like the health service and things like that. Let's not get bogged down in Brexit. Whereas Keir Starmer disastrously persuaded Jeremy Corbyn, who I'm sure voted leave in the referendum and didn't want to return to this particular issue, persuaded Jeremy Corbyn to go for and the Labour Party to go for a second referendum. And anybody who stayed up on that night in December 2019, obviously there were lots of other reasons why the Labour Party imploded in that election, but getting Brexit done, which is what a lot of people in the Red Wall wanted, was a key reason for that. So they're not going to go back in there. Okay. Now, obviously, the pro-EU camp in Britain will have as a long-term strategic objective trying to get Britain back into the EU, and obviously that's going to be very difficult without having another referendum. So there are forces in British politics that would like another referendum. And I think that's those people are hoping is that they will have looked at the opinion polls, which seem to show that lots of people, majorities now are against Britain not being a member of the EU and in Britain being in favour of the EU, and thought, yeah, if we had another referendum, then this time we would win. People have finally seen through it. It's kind of biased regret. The problem here for this camp is that it's going to be a different question next time, because the question is not going to be remain or leave. The question is going to be rejoin, okay, rather than remain. Now the problem with rejoining is that, one of the strongest arguments that the Remain camp had, in fact the argument that probably convinced most people to vote Remain, was the disruption that would be caused by leaving the EU, which they were not particularly keen on, but they didn't want all that disruption. Okay, the longer that Britain is not a member of the EU, the more that it's realigning in terms of trade relationships, of how it organises itself internationally, the more difficult it then becomes to join the EU. So the inflection point becomes different from what it was in 2016, and one of the pro-EU camp's strongest arguments goes out of the window, basically. I think that's the problem. Plus the fact that Britain will be a supplicant. They won't get the budget rebate that they got last time. They'll be forced to join the euro, and a lot of people, even who are in favour of the EU, are not so in favour of the euro. Okay, so that's not what I think will happen. So the most likely scenario, I think, is if we get a Labour government, which is obviously will be very pro-EU, I think what they will try and do is to build relationships with the European Union in such a way that at some point in the future they can then argue that it is logical for Britain to actually be a member of the EU rather than just cooperating with it from the outside. And I think the argument will be pitched in this way. I think basically the more that Britain integrates itself in a way that a lot of the decisions that Britain conforms to are actually taken at EU level, the easier it will be to make the argument that, well, actually, a lot of the decisions about what's going on in this country are made in a forum that we're not members of. Okay, and therefore, surely we should join and influence this rather than simply being policy takers. That's obviously a long-term strategy, but I think that's the way that the pro-EU camp is going to go. Because, as I say, it's going to be much, much more difficult for them to make the argument next time, because the inflection point is different. They're arguing for rejoin is much, much more difficult than arguing for remain.
So, Professor Taggart, as mentioned in the beginning, Europe is currently boiling. It's been receiving threats from multiple fronts. There's a war raging. Many states are at risk of losing their sovereignty. We have the rise of populism, obviously, which is evident throughout Europe. So, is democracy at risk in Europe? Why would you consider? What would you consider the greatest threat to democracy in Europe?
Well, is democracy at risk? Yeah, democracy is always at risk in the sense it's a contested concept, and it's one that's dynamic and changing. And I'm going to say something slightly counterintuitive, which is I'm not entirely convinced that democracy is hugely at risk in Europe at the moment. Just to be controversial, in the sense that I don't think that the institutions of democracy are fundamentally challenged in ways that they are elsewhere. I'm more concerned about other parts of the world. I'll say more if you want later on. But in terms of European context, not so much. Let me explain a little bit more. I don't think that populism necessarily is a threat to democracy. I think it's a form of democracy, and it only works through democracy. Democracy has these two elements to me. Obvious things of electoral, the thin version of democracy, which is free elections, and the thick version is elections and rights and protection of minorities. And I think that the populism, the right-wing version, is very much trying to redress that balance and trying to say we've not got enough focus on the popular majority, whether you believe it or not, and that's not actually anti-democratic. There are the margins. There are some concerns that I have about some populists, but also concerns about some non-populists. If I'm honest, I'm more concerns about authoritarians. So I'm not convinced that democracy has that sort of threat. But where do the threats therefore come from? I think that there are three threats. Is that easy to say? The first is, I think, Putin. I mean, I think that the overthrow of a democratic state and the overtaking of it by invasion, that's the most substantial threat to a democracy. You see, now, Ukraine is not a perfect democracy. We know there's corruption in it, we know that there are issues about it, but that's authoritarian states invading democracies and taking them over. That is a pretty serious one, and obviously the implications of if Putin is to get success in Ukraine, what that would mean for other states, Moldova or whatever, so nearby. So Putin authoritarians overturning democracy is more important in the way, to me, than what's happening within European states. The second, and perhaps this goes back to the populism, I think I'm more concerned about polarisation. I'm more concerned that politics has become polarised in a very general sense, and that, to me, is it's both something that feeds into the success of populism, but it's also something that populism tends to generate. And I think there's something now, and I can't quite put my finger on what it is exactly, that's driving this, but it's not that recent, the last 20 years or so, that has meant that politics has become, in certain parts of the world, much more polarised. And this, I'm looking at your questions, that made me realise how important this is to me. Politics is about plurality. It's about lots of variation. It's about different solutions to problems. As soon as you start saying politics is black and white, us and them, the good and the bad, and equating them, then to me that's really worrying, because democracy is actually about, it's not about making one side win, one side lose all the time. It's about building coalitions and creating winners and losers for short periods of time, admittedly. Sorry, so that sounds very theoretical, but the point I'm trying to make is the polarisation of society and the polarisations of politics, which are both generated sometimes by populists, but they're also what populists feed on. That's the real threat to democracy. As soon as you make it black and white, and you can probably see here that I'm obsessed with Trump, so I'm thinking Trump here. That polarisation is much more dramatic in the US than it is in most European states. So that's the second biggest threat. The third one is something, I'm going to use a term that I'm trying to push a little bit. Others might have heard it before from me. I think the rise of what I call unpolitics is really important. The power of unpolitics is one of the threats to democracy, and that is the attempt to mobilise a sense of frustration or distance from politics as a mobilising force in politics. Clearly it's an oxymoron, because I'm trying to say you criticise this force, clearly you lose the unpolitics, but I think there's something about some figures in politics where they are very, very effective at essentially mobilising that disposition which is not at all political, bringing that into politics in a negative way. And that is often behind, not always, but quite often behind the rise of many of the anti-establishment forces. So, for example, the rise of conspiracy theories, the idea that somehow there's something going on, there's a secret cabal controlling things. The predisposition to think in those terms, to me, is an indicator about unpolitics, because politics is never that simple. Or the emphasis upon, I hate using this word, but I'm going to use it, sort of charismatic leaders, which is kind of driving kind of an attraction to individuals, which is almost like a religious commitment or a cultish commitment to individuals. I'll support this person, not for what they stand for, but for who they are. That, again, to me, that's a refutation of politics, and that goes against politics. And to some extent, also the kind of the war metaphor that comes very strongly with seeing your opponents as your enemies, and arguing that if you're on the other side politically, everything about you is morally vacuous and wrong. That's kind of a war metaphor, and that's quite a powerful force, or has been used quite extensively. So those are sort of what I would call tropes. They indicate there's something going on. There's some resources being mobilised by certain politicians that is very effective at shaping politics. But the paradox is that it creates chaos. It creates chaos that then feeds further support for this kind of what I call the power of unpolitics. So that's a very abstract idea, but there's something that's, to me, underneath, not all, but underneath the appeal of many populists. It's underneath the appeal of some non-populists as well. I think something more deeper than saying it's just populism's a threat. I think there's something else going on there that creates chaos. And if I can just get back to Alex's first question, that Trump is an example of the armed politics. Biden, in a sense, was resetting American politics to get rid of that. But if Trump gets in again, it shows that actually politics, you might have a cycle where you have unpolitics, politics, unpolitics, politics, and that's very worrying for me. And I'm more scared about democracy in the United States, India, than I am in European states. Not to say I haven't got concerned about European states, but I think we can overstate it at times.
Okay, time for questions. Who has questions?
I have a question about, you said America is like wanting to withdraw support for European militaries, and I was confused because I feel like that's, if they want European countries just to have more arms, isn't that going to be a destabilizing force, and isn't that against their interests?
Well, Alex, you can come back.
I think that I think basically Trump and a lot of that sort of milieu think that Europe's been free riding for too long, essentially, and it needs to be forced in order to increase its expenditure and to contribute more to NATO. That you can't sustain a situation, and why should Americans sustain a situation in the longer term where effectively they're allowing European powers, countries like Germany, which is the most wealthy, although a bit sclerotic at the moment, the economy, to essentially free ride on America. And that's essentially, I think, what he's trying to force his hand to do, or to force Europe's hand to do. And to be honest, there's not really much alternative, because the alternative that's sometimes posed, which is an alternative European defence arm, all of that presupposes that there's actually some kind of a serious army that Europe's got in order that it can defend itself. And it hasn't. Britain's got a fairly serious army. France is sort of okay. Poland, when it's going to spend 4% on GDP, of its GDP on defence, kind of has. The rest of the European armed forces are in a shocking state. There's 3 factories in Europe that can produce ammunition, basically. That's why Ukraine is on the defensive, essentially, because they're not getting enough ammunition because it's not goods from Europe. So I think that's what he's trying to do. That's what he's trying to say, and he's saying it in his, the remark he made, which was at at an election rally, was, well, if they don't do it, I'll actually encourage people to come and invade them. I don't. It's a nonsense remark, of course, but it shouldn't be taken at face value. One thing Donald Trump really likes doing, and is fantastically good at doing, is winding up his opponents. He's very, very good at this. Owning the libs, I think, is the expression. So, and I think with Trump, what you have to separate out is a lot of the rhetorical stuff that he'll do and the actual policy substance. And the policy substance is he wants to force Europe to spend more on defence. Okay, that's what he did in his first term, and it actually worked quite well. And that's what he's going to do in his second term. And there'll be a lot of threatening around that, because he, and indeed a lot of Americans, thinks, why the hell should we subsidise Europe's defence policy? Why should they contract it out to us? They're perfectly capable of doing this. Their economy, the countries with large economies let them do it.
Can I come back on that a little bit? It's that I think what Trump was very good was getting out of things. Quite good at withdrawing from things, right? So he withdrew from the World Health Organization, the Paris Accords. He came pretty close, if the count to be believed, from withdrawing from NATO. He had to be persuaded out of it on the flight where I don't know where he was going. Now, Alex is right. To some extent, he shoots from the hip, and part of it is to rile the opponents. But I think the 2 things that Trump threatens Europe with are, one, the possibility of ceasing support for Ukraine. That would change the game fundamentally. For the reasons Alex has said, Europe is not really good at supporting other parts of Europe, but it's good at supporting Ukraine. But secondly, I think that I don't take his comment so lightly that he wouldn't honour the NATO agreement. You know, even he might withdraw, or he might say, well, we'll be in NATO, but we won't actually intervene. We won't abide by Article 5, which essentially means you're withdrawing from NATO. That's really fundamental. I think it really means that European leaders have to think very hard about their own security and to think very differently about it. They can't rely on the United States. I think it would be quite dramatic. You know, but I can see a situation where he would try and withdraw from NATO. I suspect that's, if you take his first term as the template, that's not beyond the realms of possibility.
How much of so populism itself, do you think that's partly due to social media and just the rise of the internet in general?
No.
Yeah.
No, not really. But I mean, okay. Sorry, I don't mean that's a glib response. I mean, I always ask this question, and it's a good question. I worry. Populists existed before social media. Populists got into power in very many countries before social media. Has something changed from social media? Clearly, yes. I'd be naive if I said nothing's changed. Has it fundamentally changed the equation? I don't get that sense of it has. But it's an intuitive response. It's not an academic response. Sorry. And I also think that, you know, I joke with my grown-up sons that the answer to everything is social media. Whatever the question is these days, it's because of social media. Well, sometimes they're right. But I think that we tend to overestimate that that's changed. Has there been disinformation before? Has there been propaganda before? Has there been selective use of facts before? Yes. Has there been people living in their own echo chambers? Yeah, that's nothing new. People buy their own used to buy newspapers according to what they believe. There is something new. I'm not saying there isn't something new, but I don't think this is the silver bullet answer as to why there's so much populism now. But you know, I'm very happy to be proved wrong. Aleks?
Can I say something? Yeah, I'm not going to use the word populism. Damn, I used it. No, the other word I'm going to use is polarisation, because I think that there is something in that in terms of. So the difference is, I think, I mean, at one time, people reflected and had more time and space to reflect carefully before they took a political position on something. Okay, you go to a meeting like this and you'd hear an argument that you hadn't heard before or that made you think differently, and you'd sort of go away and think, well, yeah, maybe there is something in that or whatever, because you're not forced to instantly take a position on it. And the thing about social media is, and I think the pace of it is that it forces people to take political positions on things much more quickly. Therefore, people are much less reflective about them, much more critical, and therefore much more likely to polarise and to come down on one side or the other. So for me, I think that's I mean, I say this, I probably use social media much less than you, but that's a big difference, I think, to when I was kind of your age and you go to a meeting and you think about something and you could privately reflect on things, whereas the social media forces people to take positions very, very quickly, and that's much more likely to polarise them and much more likely to make them open to a position that wouldn't necessarily be the one that they would intuitively go with, or all that their mates would intuitively go with.
What do you think the main cause of Brexit was, or Euroscepticism?
The main cause of Brexit? I mean, this is
You could put it down to one.
Sorry?
You could put it down to one thing.
Well, I think Britain has just basically drifted away from the European Union and felt semi-detached from it for a long, long time. I think, basically, I think people in Britain felt that it was that the way the EU was developing and Britain's trajectories were just simply going on different tracks. And I think, it's very interesting. When we about 10 years ago, Paul may remember this. We had a seminar which was organised by a thing called the Sussex European Institute, which Paul and I were co-directors of. And we got a chap called Peter Kellner, who's very pro-EU incidentally. In fact, his wife was a high representative for foreign affairs. He presented polling data, and so this was before the referendum or anything like that, and he said 45%, polling showed that 45% of people would vote to leave the EU, come what may. Okay, come what may. So that was the kind of the starting, the starting base, if you like. So really, in a sense, the pro-EU camp, it was kind of all uphill really. It was getting people to vote for something that a lot of them actually felt really uncomfortable with. They weren't very happy with the trajectory of it, and therefore, you know, that explains their project fear, I think, things like that, which they're very criticised for, but I actually don't think that they had any other alternative. I think there's another thing about it. It sort of ties in with what Paul says. I mean, I think the biggest threat to democracy, if you like, or political stability is the disconnect between a lot of what people feel at mass level, okay, and the ability for it to find expression in the political system, okay. And I think this was I think the Brexit was one of those phenomena. There was clearly a much greater groundswell of support for Britain leaving the EU than actually found expression for in the political system, okay, among political elites, which obviously caused enormous problems after the referendum, where they had to implement this policy which they all hated and despised, but had to desperately try and find some way around it. So I think that I mean, one of the things about Brexit is that I think people voted on the issue. I mean, you know, and people didn't want to be members of the European Union, and I think, you know, Britain had been drifting apart from the EU for a long time, basically. But I also think it played into this thing about, you know, an elite mass disjuncture, people who felt that they had been, their voice wasn't heard within the political system. And I'm sure there's a lot of people that would have voted in that referendum, but probably would have never have voted in the election, to vote leave, I hasten to add, and probably didn't vote again apart from in 2019, maybe for the Brexit party, and then for 2019 for Boris Johnson, and probably won't vote again in the next election. So I think, you know, it's very specifically because of Britain's distinct relationship with the EU, but also part of a kind of broader phenomena of elite mass dissonance, if you like, and the masses feeling that they can't find any expression through the mainstream political system for things that they believe, which clearly wasn't the case with Britain leaving the EU. I mean, Britain would never have left the EU if we hadn't had a referendum, as simple as that.
Can I give a different answer? I disagree. I mean, I like to ask one factor. I think what makes the UK different is its two major parties. I think the party system in Britain and the nature of Labour and Conservative Party, both parties created Labour and created Brexit. Complicated argument, but it's essentially, so Alex puts it down to public opinion and Britain drifting away. I think it's how it's framed. I think it's how the European issue has been contested in British politics. So it's conservative, it's been a long conservative part of the Conservative project, not the whole party, but it's been contestation within there. The Conservative Party is a weird kind of mix. There's no other party like it. It's not got a Christian democratic tradition within it. It's not the sort of the right you get elsewhere. Nearest things perhaps the moderates in Sweden. It's a very strange party, unusual. Labour, similarly, is a mixture of what would be a normal social democratic party with a kind of left party. There'd be two parties elsewhere, so it's a weird coalition. And both of those, and I think that, you know, the Conservative Party, for strange reasons and ideological reasons, to be unusually susceptible to Euroscepticism, and that's grown. And I think Labour played a very strong role in not framing the European issue in the UK. I think Blair and Brown, in not selling Europe, they made a deliberate decision that when your enemy is tearing themselves apart, they weren't going to talk about Europe. They're quite happy to stand back from it. The long-term implications, that feeds into the way people see the EU and the UK. So my driving factor is, I think that you study the nature of the two major parties, they're very distinct, very different, and they had strong incentives, one to push Euroscepticism in a certain way, and the other to not do anything. And not doing something in politics is often as significant as doing something. So for me the trends are much longer. It's about the party system. You know, whenever I teach Euroscepticism, people say that's about Britain. Britain's weird, but it's weird belief in nationalism and well, no, France is nationalistic. It's an island, well it's not an island, and there are loads of other islands. You know, all that stuff. To me it's about the parties. The one factor for me is the parties. They're weird.
Sorry, Paul's reminded me of something I meant to say. So actually, just to clarify, I'm not saying Britain's weird or anything like that. It may well be, but you know, that's not. I mean, I think a lot of the forces that you know led to Brexit are also evident in other countries. So that's true. One thing that I'm not agreeing with Paul necessarily, but one really important thing that happened was that a lot of at the elite level was a lot of soft Eurosceptics became hard Eurosceptics, basically. So there were a lot of people, particularly within the Conservative Party, who thought they could achieve their objectives. They could refashion the EU into the kind of EU that they wanted. Okay, more intergovernmental, less federalist, basically came to the conclusion that was impossible. Okay, and that's a key difference, I think, between Britain and a lot of the other countries, because you've still got a lot of soft Eurosceptics who share a lot of the analysis of Eurosceptics in Britain, but still believe it's possible to work within the EU to get it in line with the kind of project that they want, the suckers, but that's what they believe.
What do you think the likelihood is that Britain takes a step towards populism in the next sort of 10 years?
I've got to answer that because I don't use the words.
We're always fighting about this. How likely is it that Britain takes a step towards populism? It's funny enough, the UK has had very little populism. If you compare it to most, not all of them, but a lot of other European countries. First of all, Brexit was not populist, there were populist elements to it, but it's also liberal and conservative, globalist, anti-globalist, lots of different trends. So if we get rid of that idea, I don't think that the Conservative Party, even under Johnson, was populist. Some people disagree with me. So we've not had a lot of populism. We've had UKIP and we've had Farage and Brexit and now Reform. Well, not that much. So I'm actually struck that the UK is amazingly unpopulist. In fact, I just asked to review a book proposal about British populism, and I think, well, there's not a lot there. That's what's quite interesting. So I don't think that we've seen, we talked about France earlier. That's where we see France having much more possibility than the United States and so on, India as well. Other countries are much more susceptible to it. I think the UK is not actually being susceptible to populism. You can ask me why, but I don't have an answer to that at the moment. But it's probably something to do with the institutions.
Can I be cheeky? And can I ask you to ask that question without using the word populism? There's a serious reason why I'm asking you to do that.
Towards more of a,
See, without populism, it all falls apart, Alex, you see.
Do you mean the potential for a radical right, for example?
Yeah.
Right, okay. Yeah, so this is one of the reasons I don't use the word, because I'm never quite sure what people mean when they say it. Okay, so I always go back to them and say, tell me that question again without using it, and then they tell me and then I get what they're getting at. So they're getting at the radical right or whatever. So is there a potential for a radical right? So, I think that, looking generally, I think the political energy on the right is not with the old mainstream central right. Okay? I think it's with, the kind of social constituencies that the right is going to mobilise in the future are the kind of social constituencies that the radical right is currently mobilising. Okay? I think, in a sense, those old centre-right constituencies, they're hanging around a bit, and these parties are going to be around for a very, very long time. They'll probably get lots of votes in the European Parliament elections. But I think that's where the energy, that's where the political energy is. And in a sense, the Conservative Party in 2019 was kind of handed a realignment on a plate. Okay, look, here is a completely new social constituency. There's a people that, they've traditionally voted. There are people like in a lot of European countries, people have traditionally voted for Social Democrats or for parties of the left, but for various reasons, because the left can't tap into their feelings of economic and cultural insecurity properly, have become detached from it. There you go, Conservatives, there you go, Boris Johnson, there's a new constituency for it. They had absolutely no idea, okay, what to do with it. Okay, it's a complete mess up, probably because Boris Johnson was the most liberal Prime Minister ever, I think, in Britain, and therefore had not the faintest idea what to do with social constituencies that were primarily driven by social conservatism. So I think all the social constituencies, okay, that have accounted for the rise of these kinds of parties in other countries are all there in Britain. I think that potential is there. Okay, those people are not going to go, some of them will, but most of them are not going to go back to the Labour Party at the next election. Some of them will go to Reform, some of them will stick with the Conservatives, not many, most of them just won't bother voting. The difference is it's very, very difficult to find expression within, this comes back to Paul's point about the party system, and I do agree with him about this, within the party system as it currently is, and indeed with the electoral system that we currently have, for that political force to find its a way of expressing itself. Even someone like UKIP, 12.5% they got in what was it, the one seat or something like that in 2015. So yes, because that's where the political energy is, and that for me is where the future of the political right is, if they've got any sense. Okay, but no in Britain, because there's all kinds of institutional things that are stopping it. But those people are not going to go away. They're still going to be there. They're not going to vote Labour next time. And if some constituency, if some political force that emerges that can mobilise them, then they will mobilise them.
Yes, please.
Me, yeah, so it's a bit of a mouthful, but do you think that Brexit has led to a significant blurring of the lines between traditional ideological concepts of left and right wing politics? And do you think that Brexit has led to an increase in floating voters who purely vote based on policy rather than ideology?
Right. So I think, well, what Brexit did, I mean, I'm sort of repeating my previous answer a bit, but I think what Brexit did was that it was an issue that detached a lot of voters from who were traditionally voters who would identify with the left. Okay, and for years have voted for the Labour Party or the Social Democratic Party, and it essentially made them because it was clear that the party of the left wasn't going to advance their interests and have the project that they wanted. It made them available for a political force to mobilise. I think that's the main thing. Okay, now for the reasons I just said, I don't think that political force has known what to do with that. I don't think they've been very successful with it. But in a sense, it's a catalytic thing for people that have been there for a long time. I mean, I grew up in the Red War. Okay, I mean the people I went to school with were the sons of the coal miners in North Leicestershire, who would have worked during they despised Arthur Scargill. They worked during the miners' strike. These are people who would have very sort of traditional values, would have voted Labour year after year after year because instinctively that's what they do. And I reckon a lot of those people would have voted Conservative in 2019, and they would have voted Brexit. And I think in that sense that was something that kind of detached potentially a lot of those people. Although I think a lot of those forces were kind of working themselves through anyway. A lot of those people would have just stopped voting Labour probably before 2019. But that I think was the effect of it had the effect of mobilising and identifying a political constituency that had traditionally identified with the left, but could potentially be moved over to the right.
One last question before the side question.
What is the significance of the result of the Rochdale by-election, and the response from Rishi Sunak with the emergency, talking at number 10, and consensus from Starmer, both sort of criticising the leader and suggesting there's a large fear of politicians as individuals in danger.
Should we take that one as well? I think something. Yeah. Why don't we take yours as well? Yeah.
How did Brexit influence Eurosceptic tendencies in Italy and France? Did it unify the society around the same sort of opinion, or did it just polarize the society and made it more unclear on how to vote or what to do?
I'm actually going to talk about one of the questions that Petros is going to ask me is about the impact of Brexit on other European countries. So why don't I sort of deal with that there? Rochdale by-election. Well, in my long list of things that I don't know anything about, I should have right at the very top of it put British politics, okay, especially anything that's happened. I mean, I did follow it very closely during the pandemic because the decisions of political leaders would affect whether I could get my hair cut and things like that, and whether I could teach in a classroom. But I don't follow British politics closely enough to say anything sensible about that. Can you say anything about the Rochdale by-election?
Well, I mean, it's just a bit bizarre, isn't it? I mean, because you've got the election of Galloway, who's got this third election victory. He's lost 7, hasn't he? But he does this. He goes to different constituencies and mobilises particular constituencies, and very effectively so. Fantastic speaker. But there was no Labour Party was not in the race. So, and the Conservative Party weren't in the race anyway in Rochdale, and particularly I was in the race now. So in a way, it doesn't tell us anything. I think it just tells us as a moment of frustration, particularly on the communities that supported Galloway, and that's significant, I'm not undermining it. But in terms of wider trends on British politics, it's just a bit weird to me. I mean, curiosity, but he's always going to make an impact in Parliament, and he'll use that. But I don't think it'll do what it does normally. He'll be in for a year and then out. So So I don't think it tells us anything particular dramatic about the wider shape of party politics. It tells us something about the resonance of Gaza for the particular constituencies for obvious reasons, yeah. But beyond that, not much.
Gonna have to go through with a slides question, and then we're gonna have a second Q&A round at the end. The elephant in the room, the war in Ukraine. Professor Szczerbiak, how has the war in Ukraine changed Europe?
Right. Okay. So, I mean, obviously, you know, we're dealing with a very dynamic situation. It's difficult to kind of give a snapshot of it. I mean, I think the first thing is, I mean, the very fact of having an armed conflict taking place on your continent, and one of the sides in that conflict is a nuclear armed superpower, okay, and it's fighting a country that we're aligned with, not in a formal defence alliance, but obviously, you know, the West is supporting and arming. I mean, this creates huge insecurity. Okay, I mean, you know, the scope for, you know, things going wrong is an escalation is enormous. I mean, you know, what if a you know, Russian missile fires into a NATO country accidentally, but, you know, causes substantial damage, okay, on a civilian target or a military base. Okay, well, what does that? And while people are sort of firing missiles at each other, very, very close to most European countries, that situation can always develop. So it's a kind of a banal thing to say, but once you've got if you've got a war going on, very geographically close to you, where there are two protagonists where you take a side and one of them is exceptionally powerful and can bring about Armageddon, I mean, that just, you know, it creates all kinds of instabilities. And as long as that war is going on, there's always the danger that it could escalate into something, you know, even accidentally, into something very, very unpleasant. I think, I mean, one of the sort of political implications of the war in Ukraine is obviously it moved kind of military security to the top of the political agenda. And initially, at least, although I think this is changing now, it changed the kind of security calculus. I mean, certainly, I mean, it had a long-term effect in some countries, like Sweden and Finland, for example, which have abandoned neutrality and have obviously joined NATO. There's some talk about, you know, once again about the EU developing into some kind of a military alliance. I mean, you know, I'm very, very sceptical. I'm not going to hold my breath for the EU army to come and rescue you. I wouldn't do that. Initially, one of its impact was to really discredit Germany, okay, as a security actor. I think this is very significant. It meant initially, for example, that America, the Biden administration, which, as I say, essentially channeled its relations through Germany with the rest of Europe, it's effectively kind of contracted out European relations, suddenly realised, because of the catastrophic way that Germany misread Russia, okay, developed bilateral relations with them over the heads of the post-communist states, basically were bought off through cheap energy, things like, you know, the Nord Stream pipeline, for example, you know, classic example. The whole strategy about how, you know, if you develop business links, we're inevitably going to, if you constructively engage with them that way, that will win them round to their point of view, which is obviously a narrative really for a very self-serving business first sort of money-making strategy. But Germany, in that kind of initial moment, was completely discredited, and people were kind of looking around for what might be alternative security alliances. I mean, obviously America, you know, suddenly comes back in the frame, and people, because that's a credible security actor. But also, I mean, some of the things like the project of the Polish government at the time to try and build alliances between the post-communist states, okay, most of which had generally decided to advance their interests through getting very, very close to Germany, the so-called European mainstream. Well, suddenly, with military security moving to the top of the agenda and Germany being completely discredited as a security actor, okay, on energy as well as military security, I should say, suddenly the project of developing alternative power blocks kind of opened itself up, okay, and the situation looked really dire for Germany. I think, to finish the story, I think Germany is basically recapturing its position, or seems to be recapturing its position, because it's basically persuaded Ukraine to throw its lot into Germany, in with Germany, basically. I mean, we can speculate for the reasons why, but the Ukrainian government has now decided that its most important European ally is once again Germany, having completely gone off Germany at the beginning of the war because of the failure to support them. Now the Ukrainian government, as I say, we can speculate why. Is it because they want to get into the EU? Is it because they want German reconstruction? Have basically thrown their lot in with Germany, and in a sense, all that project of trying to develop alternative alliances to Germany with it disgraced as a security actor are completely undercut, because if the main country whose security is threatened is Ukraine, is building very, very close links with Germany and not anybody else, well, that goes. And also you've had a change of government in Poland. The government in Poland is not interested in developing alternative axes. So I think it's quite dynamic, and I think the German situation initially got very, very bad, but then it suddenly got much better. And of course, if Trump gets in and there's a big push to end the war in Ukraine, that's brilliant for Germany, because that's really what they want, basically. So although they'll complain a lot about him and probably not like him very much, actually that particular dynamic, if it's accelerated by a Trump presidency, will probably align with what Germany's interests are, which is to end the war as quickly as possible and normalise relations as soon as possible, obviously bearing in mind that's not possible while Putin's there.
Professor Taggart, you previously mentioned that populism has been there, has always been there, basically, and you are more afraid of the rise of politics as a danger to democracy rather than populism. But what explains the different levels of success of populist parties across Europe, and has populism become part of the contemporary European political mainstream?
Two very well phrased questions, those. They come from my module. Well, it's good to be made to answer your own questions, isn't it? Make students write essays on them. So, I mean, the thing about populism, the difficulty about populism is it's a thin-centred ideology. It requires other ideologies to go along with it in order to become a mobilised force, which is why, as Aleks said, you'll be clear, you talk about radical right or left populism or whatever. So there isn't a single answer as to what makes populism successful. It often depends what it's merged with, or what its host ideology is. And different host ideologies can have more success in different sorts of states. So this is the great difficulty studying populism. There's nothing is purely populist. It's always populist and something else, and that makes it quite difficult. But it means that it often isn't a single answer. I do think that the behaviour of, and here I'm going to use kind of the populist language, the mainstream, the established parties is significant. So those states where you've had systems where you've often got politics apparently wrapped up between two main parties, often are cases that you get a lot of populism. Austria had very early success of the populist radical right version, because it was seen as almost tied up between the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats. There were sort of these kind of coalitions that excluded people. France, again, why is Le Pen so successful? Why both Le Pens, my father and Jean-Marie and Marine Le Pen, is because the French system was dualistic, was this block. So very often when you get, it's not hard and fast rule, because it goes back to the question about Britain. Britain, dualistic Westminster is, it doesn't have populism. But the way that the mainstream is, and the way that they've interacted, the less pluralistic they are, the more likely you are to get populism, pretty simply. Not always, it varies a little bit. The other thing is there are structural factors, electoral systems, party systems. There's some more space in some systems for it to be successful. The French case, the presidential system also encourages or allows populism to get a particular platform. So there are structural factors that differ. But I'm afraid there isn't a one-shot kind of answer there. What makes the mainstream? Well, I think there are three ways of saying this. I mean, has populism become in the mainstream? Well, if it's become the government, then yes. Come your ears, Aleks. Poland, yes, it was Law and Justice for me was populist. Orban is populist. Erdogan is populist. So that's an example of it mainstream. But it also can be mainstream when it's one of the major contesters for power. It hasn't got in there, so Marine Le Pen's not got into the presidency yet. It hasn't controlled the government, but could do. So when it becomes one of the competing main powers, but you can also argue some of the ideas of populism have become mainstream, and that's seen as a very negative thing. Particularly those who are concerned about the radical right, the populist radical right. Well, weirdly, I think that that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think that the rise of populist radical right is often due to the fact that certain ideas have not been talked about. They're not talking about European integration, they're not talking about immigration. That has, in a sense, given rise to the support for these parties. And once you start to talk about them, and talk about them in a way that's not dualistic and binary, but is pluralistic, then that's how you get policy solutions. So I end up in a weird kind of, get myself in real trouble here, but I think that the causes of some of the things that populists say are right, and the problem with a lot of populist scholars is that say we don't want to listen to them, it's excluding the idea of a cordon sanitaire, but actually sometimes the issue is not about excluding them, but about dealing with their issues, and perhaps dealing in not in the ways that they say if you don't like them, but you've got to listen to them, and in that sense I kind of agree with Aleks about that differentiation. No, sorry.
Steady on.
Steady on. I'll try not to agree with Aleks, it's one of my rules of thumb. So yeah, sorry, that's the long answer. But the mainstream can be in government, mainstream parties, but it can also mainstreaming some of the ideas and the issues. I should answer that question in my own 4 minutes term. I should do a 2,000 word essay, that's what I should do. That'll teach me.
Lovely phrase, that question indeed. Professor Szczerbiak, this subject has been touched on multiple times today, but how has the rest of Europe responded to Brexit? You mentioned that there is no chance for a second Brexit referendum in the UK. There is a possibility for a Scottish referendum. This is something that has been thought to be likely. So, yes, how has Europe responded to Brexit?
Just on the Scottish referendums, remember they'll be voting to rejoin, okay? It's not remain, so they'll have to negotiate a new deal, they'll have to join the Euro. I wonder how that's going to go down with people in Scotland. So that's a really nice example of how if they want to rejoin the EU, they'll go as supplicants, basically. It will be a very different thing that they'll be voting on than the UK, that they will vote when they were voting on as part of the UK. In 2016, obviously assuming that there's a separate Scottish vote, which at the moment looks even less or even more hypothetical than a second Brexit referendum is an independent Scotland. That's by the by. So yeah, I mean, in terms of how the rest of Europe respond to Brexit, which was your question here at the front as well, about particular countries. So, I mean, unlike everything I've spoken to about now, which is just a kind of, shoot from the hip rant, basically, about what I think about things, Paul and I actually did some research on this, okay? We actually did some research, and we in fact, we wrote an article, which if you're interested is in the Journal of European Public Policy, about, and what we did was we got some experts in lots of different European countries that we've worked with for 20 years, and we asked them precisely this question. We asked them, what's been the impact of, at that time, the 3 crises, okay, that the EU had gone through, which was the Eurozone crisis, the migration crisis, and the Brexit crisis, by which we mean the crisis brought upon by the UK's vote to leave the EU. Britain hadn't left the EU at that stage. This was 2018. Okay, so obviously there is some data there. Obviously this is dated because, I mean, what a crisis has there been since there's been COVID, there's been Ukraine war, so it's all very much in the rear view mirror, Brexit. But even then, I mean, one of the things we found was how little impact Brexit had certainly in terms of the party debates, but also the public debates that took place in other EU members. The impact was very, very limited, particularly compared with the other crises that we looked at, the Eurozone crisis and the migration crisis. The whole process after the initial vote was something that was very difficult for people to relate to, because it was very kind of distant, very abstract, very complicated. It was about political elites in institutions that people didn't understand, negotiating agreements that they couldn't make any sense of. So Brexit, suddenly from a piece of political drama, which it was in June 2016, suddenly became this very dry technocratic process, for a start. which made it disconnected from politics. It also didn't, which was one of the things that we thought might be possible, provide a kind of legitimising narrative for hard Eurosceptics, people who wanted to leave the EU in other countries. Okay, this is what we thought. We would say, look, you know, it is possible, it can be done, you know, Britain is doing it, therefore we should consider it in our country. After a very sort of initial upsurge, when you got a few people saying that, suddenly people kind of rode back from that. And it was precisely because the process was seen as very complicated, not very smooth, that put a lot of people off advocating it. Okay. I mean, you can argue, if you're a Eurosceptic, what you would say is that the EU decided to give Britain a punishment beating. Okay, you know, basically the way that gangsters, if somebody steps out of line, you know, they beat them up as a warning to the others. So that's no doubt what a Eurosceptic would say. That's what the EU decided to do, and the punishment beating worked. Basically, you know, it put a lot of people off hard Euroscepticism. So I think if we get a revival of hard Euroscepticism, then I think it's not going to be because of Brexit. Basically, you know, you aren't going to get people. And even if, this is one of the things we hypothesise, even if Brexit is an unalloyed success, okay, the pro-EU camp still has the get out of jail card, which is to say, yeah, but that's Britain. You know, this is a big country, big economy. They can do it, but you know, we can't do it. I talked to one of my cousins in Poland who doesn't like the EU very much, but she says, yeah, but we've got to stay in because you can do it in Britain because you're big and whatever, but you know, we can't manage it in Poland. We would never get away with it, but you might be able to get away with it. So even then, I think, you know, even if Brexit was portrayed as an unalloyed success, it would be difficult. It was also unlikely to make an impact in that way because of British exceptionalism. I think that coming back to a point I made earlier in response to something Paul says, the force that's going to drive hard Euroscepticism in other countries is going to be soft Eurosceptics turning into hard Eurosceptics. It's going to be people who basically realise that their project, in terms of what they want to do with the EU, the way they want it to change, isn't going to be possible. It's interesting, there's a debate now in Poland, which had a terrible, stormy relationship with the EU when Law and Justice was in power. But they didn't want that. They wanted to try and put their disagreements with the EU on the trajectory of European integration on a separate track with sort of day-to-day business, bread and butter issues. But they found it wasn't possible. And a lot of people within that party, a lot of soft Eurosceptics who wanted to pursue their objectives with the EU, are now starting to say it can't be done. The EU is irredeemably hostile to the kind of vision of the European integration that we want and the kind of politics that we want, and it cannot be reformed. That's very long way down the track, but ultimately that's how I think hard Euroscepticism, Brexit-style policies will develop, not through people looking at what's going on in Britain for all the reasons I've said, but for the conclusions they come to themselves about whether the EU is reformable in the direction that they want to take.
Final question from the society's part before we reopen the floor to questions from the audience. Professor Taggart, COVID-19 is surprisingly still a thing somewhere within the multiple crises that the world is facing. What has been the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on populist parties in Europe?
Surprisingly little. When COVID-19 happened, every political scientist I know suddenly got, right, we'll do COVID-19. We was, oh my God, we've got to do projects on it, and guilty, Your Honour. I did one, looked at the response of the populist radical right, not just in Europe. And what we found is that populist radical right was probably quite differently in different states. There was no coherent response. There was no coherence to their response across the different states, which is quite surprising. You expect the idea that experts are running our life, medical experts suddenly matter. The idea that we don't have control of our borders, and suddenly we put the borders up, and it did seem to show something. You'd think it would change the game a bit, but it didn't seem to change it. And what we found is there were various responses, and had very little impact really on the success of the populists. And then we looked at populists both in government and populists in opposition. So surprisingly, I think that, pardon the pun, that the populists have remained amazingly immune to the effects of COVID-19. And it hasn't really changed the game.
you have any specific reasons in mind for the populists in unity?
Well, I don't think it was particularly a populist issue. I think it didn't really change politics as much as we all dramatically thought it might do at the time. I don't know if Alex agrees. So I mean, so it's not just the populists. It's, you say COVID's still 19 still around. It's still a question on the European politics course. Yeah, certainly that's true. Maybe I'll delete it for next year. But I don't think it's actually. I'm struck that it's kind of passed, and I think that it's not just a populist phenomenon of being immune to it. It hasn't really changed that much. It might have changed your experience, don't get me wrong, as individuals, young people who've gone through education at a really difficult time, but politically, I'm struck how little it changed things now. But at the beginning, I thought it really would change things.
I didn't. So,
Yeah, well,
I think we
always,
disagreed about
he always tells me he's right.
It's Captain Hindsight. Just on, I mean, I thought that COVID-19 wouldn't have a huge impact on politics. The reason being, well, first of all, kind of hypothetically, and then looking back into history, I thought it was the sort of thing people want to move on from very, very quickly. It was very traumatic. It was a horrible sort of experience. It was, politicians are flailing around all over the place, desperately trying to do something, getting things wrong here, and making mistakes there. And and I thought it's the sort of thing that people would want to move on from very, very quickly, and politicians would want to move on from very, very quickly. And if you look historically, I mean, one of the striking things is how pandemics or plagues or whatever, how little imprint they leave on culture, on popular culture. I mean, look at the Spanish flu, for example, which was much more devastating than COVID-19. Many, many more people died as a result of the Spanish flu after the First World War. Can you think of books that were written about the Spanish flu? Can you think of plays that were written about it? Even at the time, it was an event that people wanted to move on from very, very quickly. Okay, and that was my hunch. Okay, I thought it was the sort of thing that people and political elites would just want to forget and move on from, because it's sort of traumatic. They don't want to dwell on it, so I didn't specifically address it in terms of the parties that Paul was looking at. But that was my take. That's what I thought, and I think that is largely what's happened.
What's your favourite thing about Brexit? And I don't know, maybe during the process or after. Yeah.
Have you got a favourite thing about Brexit?
Favourite thing about Brexit? That's a strange question. I like strange questions. Well, selfishly, it's given me a lot to teach about. So I taught Brexit while it was going on from 2016 onwards. I've stopped teaching it now on the grounds of PTSD. I can't relive it one more time. Moved into Euroscepticism as an issue. So I've always quite enjoyed looking at topics that are moving. I quite enjoy things that Alex, as you can see, is much more level-headed. He sees the future, knows that it won't matter. So what I've enjoyed, is probably teaching it. But yeah, that would be my favourite thing about it.
It was fascinating watching the political elites, or the cultural elites, the business elites, suddenly who had been used to winning everything for years, suddenly finding their world turned upside down. That was fascinating, their response to that, how they should relate to it. I mean, it was a moment where politics was just kind of completely turned on its head, and then for a period was very, very interesting. I mean, I say I don't follow British politics. Actually, during the Brexit stroke Corbyn period, I think British politics became very, very interesting. And part of it was watching the way that these people who really didn't want this policy, they absolutely hated it, would do anything that they possibly could to try and block it, stop it, modify it, were forced to have to implement it and work with it. And ultimately, they made 2 elections take place before they finally came to terms with it, but eventually they did. And I think, whether you like it or not, and obviously people have different views about Brexit, but it was a fascinating process to watch. Watching people who were used to getting their own way for years and years and years, suddenly finding themselves completely on the back foot and not knowing how to react in this particular situation. It's one of the most politically fascinating things I think I've ever seen in my life.
Will there be a significant consequence of Sweden joining NATO and general NATO expansion? More consensus within Europe, or is it just purely based on response to the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think the response to the war in Ukraine was the catalyst for Sweden to join. But I think, Sweden and Finland joining will have an impact on NATO. These are countries that potentially, militarily, can make a serious contribution. So these are countries that will kind of punch above their weight potentially. So I think in terms of and Donald Trump will be very pleased with Sweden and Finland. He'll defend them. I think, quite simply, I think the longer term effect will be to strengthen NATO essentially, which is obviously a downside for Putin because that's not what he wanted, but clearly a price he's prepared to pay.
What do you think the future of the Democratic Party in the US is after Joe Biden, considering that there's not much significant leadership within the party at the moment, as well as Joe Biden's age?
Definitely Paul.
Joe Biden's
What's it? Okay, so I teach American politics. So one of the things I start with is that the American parties are not like the UK parties, and they're not like European parties. They're different creatures. They're candidate-centred organisations. And actually, you need to differentiate between the congressional wings and the Democrat and the presidential wings. That's my kind of academic caveat. What will the future be after Biden? You're really arguing. Do you mean after he's won the presidency or after he's lost the presidency? Do you think he's going to win or lose?
I think if he remains, remains as the leader. I think he's probably going to lose.
Yeah. I think what happens is traditionally that the parties go into a period of kind of abeyance once they've lost, and you'll see various different leaders come around and drive it. So it's not a very good answer, but it's to say that it's the presidential wing of the party. Once it's defeated, takes 2 years to lick its wounds, and then you'll see people coming up and trying to take it over. You've seen at the moment, obviously, what's happening with Trump is successfully taking over the Republican Party, or re-establishing, or if he ever lost it. Despite the massive victory that Nikki Haley got in Washington DC last night, that's not going to change the game. So the parties are kind of captured by individuals, especially the presidential wing. The paradox, of course, is that, and this is the paradox of all these things, which is if you take it in the populist thing, the paradox is the demographics are on the Democrat side. The people who vote for Republican, who vote populist, are older and are going to die. Okay, the younger generations are less amenable to those messages. So weirdly, even if Biden is not successful, the long term looks quite a good prospect if things stay as they are. If the Republican Party stays in hock to the white nationalism that it's committed itself to. But I don't know who, I don't know how, but it will emerge. It's a contest. It's a kind of race. But you've got to remember, it's from the bottom up. It's not a top-down thing where you select a leader. Essentially, the leader selects the party, I think.
Paul, do you believe that the term populist is used accurately today by the general public? Do you believe there are groups of people who are called populist that aren't, or groups of people that aren't called populist that should be?
Yes, I believe that it's used incorrectly very extensively. A lot of people are mislabeled populists who are not populists. I don't think it's the case. There's lots of populists who should be called populists who aren't identified. I think we tend to use it quite broadly. We have a former PhD student of ours who's now a very successful academic writes about populism. He got very annoyed with the newspapers using the word populism wrong. He said, they shouldn't be allowed to do it. I said, free press, freedom of speech. Academics are not that significant. He's very annoyed about it. So we can't stop people using it, but I think it's much too widely used for me. The key thing for me is that populism has to have anti-establishment element to it, or anti-elite. It has to have what some would define as a commitment to the people. I define as a commitment to the heartland, but let's say the people for the minute. But those two things are not enough, because those two things also define fascism, they define communism. And so what defines populism is its ambivalence about politics. And only when you get those three things in combination do you find a real populist. So someone like Johnson is not a populist. He doesn't have any ambivalence about politics. It's fantastic. He's very at home with it. His appeal is not, to me about, unpolitics to some extent. Same with Corbyn. Corbyn's misidentified as populist. He's not a populist. He's a left socialist. He doesn't need the word populism. But very often it's used, Bernie Sanders, I could go on, Tony Blair, all these people, they're not populist. It defines a certain specific set of people whose appeal is to this kind of real ambivalence about politics. and I think it should be used in that sense. But it isn't just on the right; it's also on the left. We've got to recognise that both in Europe, but also in Latin America, left populism has been as significant, more significant in Latin America than right populism. That's what's interesting to me. Did I answer that? Yeah, I think I did. You're pushing my button there, using the term wrongly.
Any other questions?
Do you want to disagree with what we've said? I mean, I'm really interested whether we've said things that people want to push back on, because I mean, Alex and I try to shoot from the hip here. We don't necessarily know what we're talking about always, especially Alex.
I was just
Yeah.
talking about your definition. Would you say Trump is populist?
Yeah.
Is
I
he
would.
ambivalent to the political views?
Well, he's anti-elite. He claimed he embodies a certain appeal to the heartland. Interestingly, he doesn't actually talk about the people very much. The speeches were written when his inauguration speech talked about the people, but that's written by Bannon. He doesn't use that language, but I think his appeal is from there. But is he ambivalent about politics? You betcha. You know, he's a massive. I get a bit triggered by Trump. You can tell, can't you? But Trump's definitively populist for me. Yeah, absolutely.
Alex, if you had to define populism, what would you define it?
I wouldn't.
Go on, you got to answer.
I wouldn't define it. No. So what? Okay. So I mean, why do I not use the P word? Well, it's partly because because I don't know what people mean when they use it. Okay, they say, well, is so and so populist, or do you think this is populism, or whatever? Or what do you think of the prospects for populism in Poland? And a lot of the time, I don't really know what people mean, and therefore I do what I did this poor person, which is say, tell me that again, and then I get what you mean. So it's partly just because of the way that it's used in the vernacular that I find confuses rather than clarifies. I don't really know what people are getting at. I think that, I mean, there obviously are lots of people in academia, and Paul's one of them. Of all the people who've done this, he's probably made one of the more convincing attempts, in my view, to try and conceptualize this properly. People do kind of work on this. I suppose my problem with it is, I mean, if you're talking about a kind of a party family or something, I mean, there are essentially two ways that you define what a party family is. I mean, one is through self-declaration. Okay, people say, I am a liberal, I am a conservative, I'm a green, I am a social democrat, I'm a communist or whatever. So, you can, that's one way. And then the other way, sometimes used in association with this, is objectively. You can look at what the kind of ideological canons are. So, if you want to know what a social conservative, whether someone's a conservative, look at the work of Edmund Burke. You want to know somebody's a communist, look at Marx and Lenin. You want social democrat, look at Edward Bernstein. A Christian Democrat, look at the writings of Pope Leo XIII or something like that. Catholic social teaching, basically. So and that's the way you can do it. And my problem is that it doesn't kind of work really. Either of those approaches don't work for populists, because apart from the guys in America, there's no self-described populist that I've come across. And obviously I've looked at this as much as Paul. And also, there's no populist canons. I don't think there's no kind of intellectual canons, and you can then sit down and say, you objectively define them. Now, there is a group of people who do sit down and say, right, well, let's define populism. My problem is with the way that they do it. They basically pick a set of parties and they say, these are populists, okay? And so what do they have in common? That's how we define populism. But my problem with that is you're a priori picking a group of parties and then looking for the similarities between them. Okay, so somebody somewhere decides these are the populist parties, and then we will have a definition. There's also kind of individual bits about a lot of the definitions. Paul hasn't used this, but there's a lot of the use of the term nativism, which I'm not very comfortable with. I don't think that really captures the way that a lot of these parties tap into cultural insecurity. Again, it's a very pejorative term, I think, and so I'm not too happy with that. Interestingly, Paul said this, that a lot of these parties, I don't actually see that much evidence of them sort of lionising the people in that way. They're certainly anti-establishment, there's no doubt about that, which is why I tend to prefer talking about anti-establishment parties. I mean, look at Law and Justice, that's the party I know best that's categorised as populist. don't actually see much evidence of them lionising the people in that way. But these are minor things, really. I mean, these are, you know, once you get down to that, accepting that methodology for categorising a party, then, you know, you could argue about what the specific features are. But my problem is more, I'm not very comfortable about the methodology which is used. And the methodology, I think, for me, to identify a party is either self-description or having some set of objective ideological canons. Otherwise, somebody in advance decides, you know, what's the set of cases that you're analysing and looks on it on that basis.
I mean, I disagree with something what you say, but I agree with one thing, that populism, by definition, doesn't believe in learned wisdom, right? It's common sense. So he's right. There are no theorists of populism by definition, because if you have to theorise it, you're not a populist, you know. So it is difficult to establish those, and you've got, you know, I would say somewhat differently. You've got to imagine that actually it's quite hard. It's very different. It's a different sort of ideology, and that's why Aleks finds it quite hard.
Paul gets bothered about different things than what I do, and I get bothered about different things than what Paul does. I mean, that probably explains most of our disagreements about these things.
I'm more. Yeah.
Any further questions? Well, if not, join me in giving a round of applause to the speakers. Thank you for coming.
Questions? Of course.
Cheers.